Welcome to everyone who's joined for today's webinar, and a big welcome to our speakers and our discussants that have dedicated their time to put together a very rich, jam-packed schedule for the next 90 minutes on a very exciting topic, one that's shifting quite quickly. And I think there's a lot of interest to know what the latest trends are and what are the things that, for instance, emerging markets and SBN members should be focusing on. So firstly, just a recap of IFC's involvement in the green bond space. IFC was one of the earliest issuers of green bonds. We launched our green bond program in 2010 to help catalyze the market. And since then, there have been 157 bonds issued by IFC in 18 currencies and totaling over $10 billion. So we've benefited from IFC's own commitment to environmental and social performance standards and to innovation in green and climate finance. So that's made it very easy for IFC to come to this very interesting market. And IFC has been interested in bringing more players to the market, and for that reason has been involved in the Green Bond Principles Executive Committee and in the Green Bonds Impact Reporting Harmonization Framework for international financial institutions. So today's discussion brings together some of IFC's expertise, and we'll be hearing from my colleague, Mr. Francisco Avendano, at the end of this webinar. But to bring this in and package it for particularly members of the Sustainable Banking Network. So the Sustainable Banking Network, we set it up with 10 countries in 2012 because these countries were eager for information on how to create national enabling frameworks for sustainable finance. And that was before the green bond trend took off. Now we have 39 countries in our network. And as of 2016, we suddenly saw a spike in the green bond issuances, and members were very interested to know how could they capitalize on that. Sean Kidney from the Climate Bonds Initiative, who we'll be hearing from shortly, he has been closely involved in helping us share information as it happens with SBN members, and has also been very closely involved, as we have, with supporting members directly at country level to develop frameworks. One of those members is Mongolia, and we'll be hearing their case study during this webinar, as they have completed a very interesting process of consultation and dialogue at a national level to come to an agreement on what a taxonomy would look like for Mongolia. So one of the questions we'll be answering today is, why is a taxonomy important? We saw that it had a big impact, for instance, on China's green bond issuances. China introduced a catalog for green bond eligible projects in 2015. And then we saw that in 2016, they were amounted to about 30% of global issuance. So that was a big spike in response to clarity that came from having those catalogs in place. Now, everyone we've spoken to that's been involved in taxonomy processes has said it's not perfect, it's always evolving. And there's definitely a need for international alignment so that we're not reinventing the wheel in each case, that we're capitalizing on what has been gained by the taxonomies that have been developed, but still knowing that we need to adapt this to the peculiarities of particular jurisdictions. Every country has its different issues, and that's something that's very important to us in the SBN network, is to take account for what national needs are. So today's discussion will touch on some of the latest developments, including Sean will update us a little bit on the European Union's taxonomy on sustainable activities that has been finalized as of the end of last year. Mongolia's taxonomy has only recently been finalized, so this is hot off the press. And we'll also be hearing from Dr. Bolu Wang from Tsinghua University in China, where she's been very involved in China's activities. So to bring as much of the latest best practice to this call as possible. So with that, I would like to invite Sean Kidney to kick us off. Sean is CEO of the Climate Bonds Initiative, which is an international NGO working to mobilize debt capital markets for climate solutions. Projects include a scheme for green bond definitions and certification, with $34 trillion of assets represented on its board, and some 200 organizations involved in its development and governance. The Climate Bonds Initiative has emerged as a very important voice, helping to lead a lot of these discussions, and they have their own taxonomy in place. So Sean, I'd like to invite you to update us on what is happening in your world You've been very involved in the EU taxonomy development. What were the learnings that came out of that? You've also been involved in different country initiatives in emerging markets, and you're seeing taxonomies taking shape. What do you think are the things that SBN member countries and other practitioners need to keep in mind as this is happening? Thank you. Over to you, Sean.
Thank you very much, Louise, for having me involved in this and for the opportunity to speak. The idea of a taxonomy, which is essentially guidance for the market and for investors about what are green investments or sustainable investments, is something that's been developing over a few years. At the Climate Bonds Initiative, we started doing a taxonomy 8 or 9 years ago. We proposed this in our paper for the People's Bank of China some 6 years ago, and in China, the taxonomy, which was developed initially by the Green Finance Committee and then endorsed by the People's Bank of China, has been a critical part of the growth of that market. Behind all of this has been this growth of a green bonds market, as you mentioned earlier, Louise. This is current issuance. It's hit about $258 billion globally. China is the second largest market in the world after US dollars, but there are all sorts of issuers. The market has been unusual compared to previous markets because it's been what's called a use of proceeds market. That is, someone raises a bond and they allocate the proceeds to something that is seen to be green or qualifying. Now, what's that raised is this idea that we need to be conscious of the assets or the projects, not necessarily the company, which has generally been the narrative around ESG, environmental, social, and governance metrics that have been used and are still used in many sectors. It's a slightly different model. That's led to a need to have a clear understanding of what are the qualifying assets, especially when governments start introducing incentives, as China has done so with alacrity. You can get a discount rate at the liquidity lending window of the central bank if you post green bonds as collateral. Now, that requires the central bank to be very clear about what is a qualifying green bond. And that's been dealt with by regulation in China. Europe is moving in the same direction, where Europe is looking at incentives to grow the green finance and green bonds market. And as a result, regulators and the government have decided it's important to have very clear definitions, eventually to avoid greenwashing of various sorts. This hasn't been a big feature of the market so far, but if the incentives come in, you can expect some risks involved. So that's the background to this market. We've been working on the EU taxonomy now for 18 months. I'm a member of the European Union's technical expert group. And essentially the climate bonds taxonomy work has gone into that, as has the work of multinational development banks that IFC has been involved in for many, many years. So a committee of the multinational development banks has been looking at, again, what are green definitions and what should be counted in this kind of equation. That work has been fed into the process along with CBI's work. It's important to note this. IFC has a role in the European Union taxonomy, is the point I'm making. The principle behind all of this is that these are science-based rules. That is, we look at the environmental challenge we face, and then we deduct from that what are the right kinds of investments that need to be included. This is a little bit different to, say, NDCs, National Climate Change Plans, because they have generally been mediated by what is possible in that country and often political constraints or other priorities of governments. The Commission specifically told us to focus on the science and not reference European Union policy. Well, that's a good thing, because in the 18 months since we've worked on this, European Commission policy has actually changed quite dramatically. In December last year, the European Commission announced the commitment to a 2050 net zero carbon target, and in fact the 2030 target of 50% reduction in emissions, in line at the International Panel of Climate Change recommendations, but the first major jurisdiction to do that. In fact, so far the only major jurisdiction to do that. And essentially they caught up with our taxonomy brief. Some of the features of the work in the European Union, which has been picked up by previous efforts such as CBI and developments, has been the idea of trying to make it relatively clear to use and ensure that the work about what is the definition is part of the development process. When an issuer of a green bond comes to market, they need to look up a list and they need to find out what do I have that qualifies or not. We've got to make it that simple. we are trying to avoid a situation where they're going to have to hire a consultant to figure out whether they qualify. In the green bond standard in Europe, people will be required to get an independent verifier, as has become the practice in most markets, such as China, thanks to regulatory direction. But we still want the issuer to first be able to do an initial assessment very easily. All the work, therefore, is in the committee process leading up to the publishing of the taxonomy. It will be dynamic. That is, the science changes. We will be updating on a regular basis. In Europe, we've said at least every 5 years, there will be a review, not necessarily a change, but a review. In some areas, we are expecting thresholds to tighten. So in the property sector, we have a reasonably broad inclusion criteria beginning, but the threshold for inclusion of buildings as green will become tougher and tougher until we get to the target of zero net carbon for all the building stock in Europe by 2050, and so on. Where we can, we will leverage or use existing labels in the market, such as the Forest Stewardship Council for forestry, as a proxy for what we're trying to achieve. There's some principles in the European taxonomy. In Europe, the regulation, and this is going to become a mandatory regulation in Europe, is going to impact two areas: financial market participants and then EU member states. The most important initiative is not actually around green bonds, it's around investor disclosure. So under the application of the Task Force on Climate Finance Related Disclosures, the TCFD, Europe's regulation will require any investor with more than 500 staff, which is the bulk of funds managed in Europe, to disclose climate risk that they have in their portfolio, as banks are being asked to do in many jurisdictions, but also sustainable assets. And when they call something sustainable, it will need to be in line with the taxonomy, that at the reference to taxonomy. As well as that, if they want to have products that are green or sustainable, whether that be sustainable funds for major investors or retail products, and there's a separate eco label that will govern the specifics of the retail product, they'll have to have a definition that's in line with the European taxonomy. Think of it as a consumer protection law, so that you will not be allowed to call something sustainable unless it's in line with the taxonomy. Now, in the agreement in December between the European Parliament, member states, and the Commission, and Europe has these tortuous processes which are necessary in a federation of countries to arrive at agreement, there was a broad support for the draft recommendations for technical expert group, i.e. we are going ahead with the recommendations we have, with one exception: they're excluding all hard fossil fuels. So coal is just a blanket exclusion. And also corporations will be required to report against this as well. The European Banking Authority has said that banks will be required. So this is separate to the green bond market. If you like, the whole financial sector in Europe is now going to be referencing the taxonomy for what it says to market about its sustainable activities, or how it talks to regulators about what it's doing, as well as green bond issuance. It's a very all-encompassing foundation tool. And the European Central Bank is now looking at how it can use the taxonomy in its work to reduce forward risk arising out of climate change. Member states will be requested to report to the European Commission on their sustainable and climate change activities using the taxonomy as well. The milestones is it'll come in as a regulation in Q4 of this year, but it'll be voluntary initially, mainly because time has to be set aside to ensure the data to allow the reporting is available. The transition period will be roughly 18 months. Then it'll become mandatory for reporting across those sectors. There are three areas that we've looked at when it comes down to specific definitions in the taxonomy. We're looking for substantial contributions to at least one of 6 environmental objectives. Our initial focus in Europe is climate change mitigation and also adaptation and resilience. We have an eye, but we haven't done a lot of work yet, on pollution control measures. China's done a lot of pollution control measures, and I think the Europeans understand they have a lot to learn from China about this. And we are starting a process of harmonization with China in May of this year, when the European Union and Chinese counterparts will meet to start looking at this question. And I think there'll be a lot of learning from both. I'm hoping there'll be a lot of learning from both sides because of the different issues that have been covered. We are looking at protection of water and marine resources and circular economy measures. Again, something China's done a lot of work on, and at biodiversity protection. Of course, all of these have some relevance to climate change, but over the next couple of years, further work will be done on these extra 4 areas. At the moment, it's primarily a climate mitigation and adaptation taxonomy, but we're requesting that investments do no significant harm to these other criteria, i.e., you can't build a major plant in an area and pollute a river at the same time, even though it gets emissions down. We also require some minimum safeguards. Essentially, we're asking for adherence to International Labour Organization principles, which is a general rule in the European Union. We are looking at 3 kinds of investments in the taxonomy. Things that are clearly low carbon already, such as renewable energy or afforestation, things that are zero emission. Those criteria are unlikely to change in the long term. Of course, everything can be subject to review as the science change. Then we're looking at things which contribute to the transition of economies. We think it's necessary for people to be very focused now on how we change things, not just in things that are green. So we're looking at the steel industry, for example, at building renovations, and at the aluminium industry, at cars. We're saying that there will be things that will be allowed to be included now, which help drive the change in those sectors. But eventually, those sectors will have to reach a tough threshold, whether that's 2025 in the auto industry. We're only allowing cars, or more likely trains and buses with some level of emissions, to be included till 2025. After that, we're expecting all transport, if it's going to be included, to be what we call zero tailpipe. That is, no emissions by the actual vehicle. We are not including things like the emissions from electricity generation. And there's a story behind that I can come to. But the narrative around how we transition our economies and tackle tough sectors, which are seen as high polluting, but we need for the future, steel and cement and so on, is a very important part of the taxonomy. Finally, we've identified enabling areas. And this is things like the manufacture of components in the building sector or in wind energy. And also grid investments. So grids enable the electrification of an economy. We believe that the economy needs to go electric very, very fast. So pretty well all grid investments will be included in this, subject to excluding a line that goes straight to a coal-fired power station that might be argued to increase emissions in the system. So these are the 3 general areas, and that'll become a narrative for taxonomy work in some of the other countries we're doing as well. In every country where we're discussing taxonomy, whether that be Canada or Colombia or Mexico or soon to be South Africa, thanks to Louise's work, the issue of what transitions look like is top of the agenda for everyone, because they're concerned about how to manage the shift in their economies as distinct from get blindsided and have whole sectors of the economy at risk or somehow or other reduced without a proper plan. So transition is something you'll hear a lot about in the future. Just to give you a flavour of some of the criteria in the European taxonomy. In the electricity generation sector, the reports of the International Panel of Climate Change, the 1.5 degree report from 2018, and of the International Energy Agency's World Energy Outlook and Sustainable Development Scenarios in 2018 and 2019 have been very influential. They basically said that to meet climate goals, and remember that our focus in Europe is climate, to meet climate goals, no new fossil fuel investments that are unabated can be included. That's been very challenging in Europe because most countries have had fossil fuels as part of their transition plans. This is new science. This is really since 2017. Essentially, the climate scientists are saying the window for using gas as a transition has closed because the emission reductions we have to achieve in the next 10 years, 50%, are so steep that we simply can't go there. So as a result, we've included in the European taxonomy what's called 100 grams of CO2 equivalent threshold per kilowatt hour, that is. Now that means that gas can be in there, it's technology agnostic, but it requires 100% carbon capture and sequestration to qualify. As you know, there's a live carbon capture and sequestration discussion and a lot of opportunities. I had a wonderful presentation in Iceland recently from Reykjavik Energy, who are capturing the emissions from the geothermal plants there, liquefying them and putting them into basalt, and the emissions are the CO2 is mineralizing in 6 to 24 months, which means it's a very stable form of sequestration, and it's costing them 26 euros a ton, unbelievably cheap compared to other alternatives. We think this is going to be a very important part of the future change. We're saying that any kind of storage is in, excepting LNG storage, but electricity storage is a really critical growth area of our economy. We're saying that things like geothermal and hydro are in, solar and wind definitely in, and so on. In the transport sector, I've already covered. We have talked about, though, the importance of hydrogen. We've specifically said that we think our economies are going to have a significant hydrogen component going forward. That will need to be what's called green hydrogen or blue hydrogen, generated from renewable energy or gas using carbon capture and sequestration. At the moment, that's only about 5% of the hydrogen generated in Europe. So there's a lot of work to be done. But the infrastructure, the usage is clearly part of the future and will be part of transport, long distance transport. We don't expect that to be part of urban-based transport. That will be electric cars from BYD and people like that. If I keep going, there's a whole section around energy efficiency investments in water infrastructure and waste management, methane management. We have a section on buildings. We've used 3 different ideas in the property sector, which is very important because this is the biggest asset class on the planet. So when it comes down to green bonds and investor portfolios, this is very important. People can use either an improvement metric, where they're allocating 30%, they're improving a building by at least 30% of emissions going forward. That investment in the renovation can be counted, or if the building is in the top 15% of buildings in a sector, such as in Ulaanbaatar, that can be counted as well. A portfolio of high-performing buildings can be used to back a green bond. That threshold will tighten, though. We expect all buildings to be zero net carbon by 2050. And then the new building criteria are a little bit different because they're based on European regulations that are coming in. We're asking for a bit better, 20% better than what are mandatory regulations for the future. There are land use criteria. Essentially, it's about maintaining and improving carbon in soils and in forests, but we've just made it easier for people by identifying best practice farming activities which will qualify as a proxy. And then finally, and in some ways most importantly, aluminium, steel, concrete, plastics, these manufacturing transition areas are spelt out. In the steel industry, we believe we can achieve substantial reductions in emissions going forward. And SSAB, the Scandinavian steel company, has just announced they'll be introducing zero carbon steel by 2026 using hydrogen, renewable energy, and so on. And that's our future for the planet. So you get a sense of what's in there. Investors will need to identify amongst their holdings all the kinds of investments that qualify and aggregate those solutions. So at the moment, we have taxonomies in Mongolia, China, and Europe, and we have a bunch of other countries around the world looking at taxonomies. These are just the ones I know about. I know Louise knows more because this is, the SBN network is helping lead this amongst emerging market regulators and the like. The critical part of how we go forward is to look for international alignment. In the work we're doing in Colombia with IFC, we've got a very clear direction from Hacienda, the Ministry of Finance, that they want their taxonomy to be internationally aligned and then look for things that need to be tailored to the Colombian circumstance. They don't want to make it hard for international investors from Europe or China to be able to invest in Colombia by having a totally different approach. And I think that will be a feature of taxonomy work in most countries that we're working in around the world. So critical elements, science-based, bring in the science experts. This should not be a province of policymakers. If you're talking of a Ministry of Environment, you want the science people in there, not the policy people. That's been very much a feature of the European process. It will need to be dynamic. There has to be scope to update it and a mechanism to review. Try and make it simple, because otherwise bankers won't understand. They're very good at structuring. They're not good at understanding environmental criteria, let alone investors need something simple. That requires us to be relatively binary, which is what you will see in most taxonomies, clear rules of what's in and what's out around the world. That's it, really. The discussion around taxonomy in the last year, thanks to what's been done in China, in Europe, and in Mongolia, has gone off like wildfire. And as a result, we think many countries are going to tackle this in the coming year. We want to create a group of people who work together and continue to collaborate on doing these taxonomies. And so that'll be part of the SBN agenda going forward. I'll stop at that point, Louise, and hand it back to you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Sean. So stay on the line because we have a couple of questions. And just to say to all our participants, we have a little bit of time between each presentation for clarification questions. So if you have anything, please do send it via the chat. So I have a couple of questions to kick it off. Just in terms of you through CBI have been and individually have been very involved in quite a few of the discussions. So you were very involved in China, you were very involved in EU, and now in emerging markets, and quite a number of the countries that SBN is working with and supporting. You already have a presence there. So China, India, Mexico, Kazakhstan, just to name a few. So it's Colombia, Nigeria, East Africa. So this is spreading like wildfire. And my sense is that everybody is watching very attentively to what's coming out each time a new taxonomy is launched. Just to give you a sense, when the topic of green bonds became interesting for SBN members in 2016, within a year or two, we saw a total of 13 frameworks that we then reviewed for a report on creating green bond markets. One of those frameworks was the ASEAN regional framework, and that has been particularly successful in terms of bringing on the ASEAN countries to an aligned approach. Do you think regional approaches are one of the strategies that we should be considering?
The more we can deal in wider markets with a common approach, the easier it's going to be for investors, issuers, banks, and everyone to understand. So an ASEAN taxonomy would be far preferable to me to a Filipino taxonomy. However, there are national considerations. Bank Negara in Malaysia has put out, as you know, a discussion document about how to take forward a taxonomy in Malaysia. The ASEAN Capital Markets Forum, I think, will be picking this up, and there's a discussion. We've got to do what we can do. The critical point is that whatever we decide to do in a region or in a country, we need to work hard at global harmonization. It is no point in having a different definition of solar in Vietnam than we have in Colombia. That's just going to make it hard for everyone. So in areas where we can easily get common agreement, we should do. And to take an example, between the Chinese taxonomy and the European taxonomy, the language is quite different. I don't just mean Chinese and English. I mean how we describe individual components. However, in practice, by far the majority of criteria are eminently transportable between the two jurisdictions. So the first harmonization job is just to align our language so people in both markets can understand. And then we'll look at areas where there are actually differences, often minor, and see if we can harmonize our criteria. And there will still be between China and Europe, probably 10% of areas where we'll have a different view. As long as we're clear about it and we put it in easy to understand language, that's fine. In Colombia, we'll try and avoid that. We'll have extra information on sectors in Colombia, particularly agriculture, that are not part of the European circumstance, but we're working on the basis of making it 100% alignment. That is no difference from the point of view of investors. Depends a bit about your national priorities, of course, in these areas, but just keep an eye on this issue. Make sure that if you're starting a taxonomy from day one, start a collaboration, a consultation with other key taxonomies in markets you want to get capital from, especially, and take that into account. That's really the point.
Fantastic, thank you. From Laura Canavari, she says, thank you, Sean, great presentation. Can you provide some examples of fiscal incentives for issuers and investors?
Well, Bolu Wang could probably talk about that. China has been the home of fiscal incentives. We've seen incentives from the central bank with macroprudential scoring, with discount capital liquidity lending window. But provinces have also been trialling incentives such as risk mitigation guarantees, or Jiangsu province even pays a third of the coupon of all green bonds in the province, which is a pretty big outlay by the government. So we will be publishing in English a review of all the incentives that have been used in China a little later this year in May. So a report will come out that regulators and governments in other countries can use, but there's a plethora there. But we've also seen incentives in other markets. In the Hungarian central bank, would you believe, recently announced a risk weighting differential in the capital ratio requirements of banks if they hold green bonds. Now that's very attractive, and that's mainly focused on the property market. So it means that banks will get a higher leverage ratio if they hold mortgages, green mortgages, if you like, in their portfolio. There's a condition, a nice twist here, which is the banks are required to pass on the savings to the homeholder. They can't make the extra profit. Nice. So, in different markets, we're going to see different variations of these kinds of incentives. It is very much part of it. But it's not necessarily to get a market going. The key thing is clarity of rules first, and then look at what incentives are going to be material for the market that you're actually in. And it'll be different depending on the kind of assets involved and the nature of the capital markets locally.
Great, thank you. So a question building on what you've just said, and this comes from an IFC colleague, Yan Wei. She says, so the EU green bond standards do not specifically include a requirement for an environmental and social screening process. Yet what you've told us about the taxonomy is that as a basis, it will have a do no harm component, that there needs to be some management of environment, social risks. And I think for IFC, we've seen that as essential. It's how we've always operated, and it was one of the reasons that made our green bonds very attractive to investors. So do you see that as a trend that's going to come in more and more?
Well, underlying, first, the green bond standard in Europe will require an independent review. So there's a verification process about it. We have deliberately focused on climate indicators as the most urgent priority. But as I've said, we've said you need to make sure you are not doing harm inadvertently or as collateral damage to other key environmental sectors such as biodiversity and so on. We are not at this stage looking at social issues beyond basic international labour organisation requirements. So there's a little bit of social protection. Rather than looking at the social and governance dimensions of the issuing entity, which has been the direction of discussion in Europe, we're saying no, like the green bond market, an organisation that may not score well on ESG, notably gas companies and oil companies and coal companies, can issue green bonds and should, because we want those organisations to have transition plans. So an oil company like Total will generally be excluded from ESG indices or metrics. However, under the European Green Bond Standard, if it issues a green bond to finance its solar company in the US, that will be absolutely included. So there's a slightly different understanding behind that. So I'm not saying that we're not looking at these issues. I'm saying the approach to doing it is a bit separate. We are also saying, however, that we want to extend the taxonomy in the next couple of years into social areas. The framework we're looking at that is SDGs. So we see that SDGs are fundamentally about the resilience, economic, social, and ecosystem resilience of countries. And we need to make sure all those indicators are going very well. So we want to have a bit more granularity. We'll be working with UNDP and others on this, on how to come up with a taxonomy that can inform that market as an extension of the sustainable market rather than as a separate market. And that will, I'm sure, lead to a lot of sustainable bond issuance from emerging markets around those criteria. So that's how we're tackling it. What we haven't done is looked at more social safeguards for green investments beyond ILO. And this is pretty consistent with taxonomy work around the world. IFC has a whole sophisticated scoring system. A lot of institutions do. It is true. We're trying to keep it simple for the moment.
Okay, fantastic. So I think we're going to squeeze in one more question because it was a very good one. And you did touch on something that is very close to the heart of most SBN members, is you can't talk about green until you talk without talking about social and sustainability. So I think we've seen a very strong demand for, how do we bring the social and sustainability up to speed as quickly as possible? And we're seeing a number of the countries that first issued green bond frameworks have then within a year or two updated that to include social and sustainability. And obviously aligning with the ICMA principles has been very useful. So related to that, we have, because SDGs and then TCFD, so Task Force on Climate Related Financial Disclosures, Those are hot topics in a lot of the SBN member countries, including South Africa. And so we have a question from Yassine Lockett from the Banking Association South Africa, which is leading. It's an BASA has been a member of SBN since 2016, and they've been very active in South Africa in pushing sustainable finance. So the question is, firstly, highly informative. So thank you, Sean. Can you please elaborate on the point you made regarding how a taxonomy can aid with furthering understanding of climate risk? And this relates to questions I've had is, how will our taxonomy discussions cover TCFD and climate risk? So what is the link?
Well, first thing about social, when people have added social and sustainable criteria to the regulations, they've added as an extra dimension, not necessarily as extra safeguards to green. So the social bond is a different market, social bond market, as distinct from an extra layer of verification of green bonds. Bear that in mind. This is a little bit different to the IFC approach. And that is very much the direction we're going in our thinking in Europe at this stage. On the climate risk disclosure, there are two things. The European Commission, member states and so on have also agreed to do a brown taxonomy that will be coming out next year, which will be used by regulators to look at climate risk issues. There is a climate risk regulation which is becoming mandatory in Europe. You'll be required to disclose your high carbon risk as well as your sustainable investments. That is the bad side and good side of the ledger from a climate perspective. You can think about climate risk in another way as well in the taxonomy. This is essentially a procurement plan for the Paris Agreement. This is essentially a prioritization for the economic development of our globe. These things are likely to be less risk going forward, and many investors are using that already. You see a stock price bounce in companies that are issuing green bonds in the European market because investors are using that as a signal that these companies are doing something that's going to make them less risk of policy impact and other sorts of impact of climate change. So if you think about it as a forward way of identifying lower risk, then it becomes really useful. And you match that against the brown taxonomy regulatory disclosures, which identify high risk, then you have a good story.
Fabulous. Thanks, Sean. I'm going to let you off the hook now. We've got questions starting to stream in, and I am taking note of them. But we're going to move on to our Mongolia presenters. So thank you. Stay with us, and we look forward to hearing possibly from you at the end of the webinar. Thanks, Sean. All right. So now I have the pleasure of introducing our presenters from Mongolia. So we have Ms. Nomandari Engter. She is currently advisor to the Mongolian Sustainable Finance Initiative on the development and implementation of a national sustainable finance roadmap, green taxonomy, and sustainable stock exchange index for Mongolia. So she's very busy. She was previously CEO of the Mongolian Sustainable Finance Institution, and since 2013, she has worked closely with Mongolian banks, policymakers, and international partners to help banks integrate environmental and social considerations. Then we have Ms. Oyungerel Munkbat. She is the Project and Partnership Manager at the Mongolian Sustainable Finance Association. Now, Oyungerel has been very closely involved on the ground in helping to push forward the finalization of the taxonomy, and we're looking forward to hearing how those final discussions went. So since taking up her role, she has worked closely with financial institutions, policymakers, and international development donor organizations in improving sustainable finance development in Mongolia. So I think that reinforces that this taxonomy work fits within a broader sustainable finance agenda. It responds in many ways to green bond issuance, but as Sean has pointed out, we're starting to see a very quickly a widening to green lending, how financial institutions disclose, how corporates disclose, and all of that information then provides finance. So I want to hand over to Nomandari and Oyungerel. We look forward to hearing about what Mongolia's journey has been.
Thank you, Louise, and thank you everyone for tuning in. So I'm Oyungerel, and we're from the Mongolian Sustainable Finance Association. And as Louise has just said, we've just recently approved our green taxonomy, national green taxonomy, and we're happy to be sharing this, and thank you for this opportunity. Today, we'll be talking about sustainable finance development in Mongolia and why we started with this green taxonomy and what kind of process we had to approve it. And Nomi will be talking in detail about the specific objectives and what were the lessons learned and how SBN members can learn from it. So to give you a bit of a background, I will be speaking about our organization, the Sustainable Finance Association. It's an industry-driven initiative that started in 2013 by the Mongolian Bankers Association. So this means that about banks that cover 90% of the Mongolian financial sector, they started implementing environmental and social risk management systems. And since 2013, our vision has been for Mongolia to become a regional sustainable finance knowledge center, and IFC has been a long-standing partner in embodying this vision. So we are a member of the SBN, and Mongolia was evaluated as at the advancing stage of the implementation phase, and we are chairing the Taxonomy Working Group as well as serving as the co-chair for the IDA Working Group. And what we primarily do is work with financial institutions and also industry sector businesses to embed sustainability into the heart of their operations. And a part of that is creating this green market, and so this is where the green taxonomy comes in. And in general, you can understand Sustainable Finance Association as this giant network and platform of collaboration and a demonstration for partnership. So likewise with sustainable finance, the main drivers for green taxonomy were the environmental issues that Mongolians are facing. So while the world tries to keep its average temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius, Mongolia is already beyond that. So we have 2.1 degrees Celsius rise in our average temperature, which is quite high. We're also facing lots of environmental issues related to urbanization. So for instance, we have air pollution. Women are 3.6 times more likely to miscarry in the winter. And 88% of our city soil is contaminated by bacteria. So not a great sight there. And to solve all these environmental issues, there has been a network of collaboration in the sustainability efforts. So on one hand, we have the policymakers. So we have the National Green Development Policy, and Mongolia has just renewed and resubmitted its nationally determined contributions to the UNFCCC. And we have set an ambitious goal of reducing GHG emissions by 22.7%, which is expected to cost around 11.7 billion USD. On the financial side, we also have the monetary policy of 2019 approved by the Parliament of Mongolia, as well as the national program to develop financial market until 2025. And in 2018, we have developed our National Sustainable Finance Roadmap, which all outline the green taxonomy as the first stage to developing green finance and sustainable finance moving forward. And on the other hand, from the policymaker side, there are the banks. And as I've said, since 2013, we have built our environmental and social safeguard capacity. And the businesses also have some potential green products that need green financing and need to realize all these green opportunities that are available globally. And however, there was no clear consensus on what green was. And so this was limiting access to green financing, and hence we identified green taxonomy as the first stage. To give you a brief, in mid-2018, there was a Green Finance Leadership Program co-hosted by Tsinghua University and IFC, and that was when the idea of Mongolian green taxonomy was really initiated. So in December of 2018, we started collaborating with Tsinghua University as well as IFC to launch our Green Taxonomy project. And after that, until June, we have been drafting. And as Sean said, with many insight into what our investors and what the market, what the standards for the investors that we wanted to tap into really needed. So we held 2 extensive consultations and a lot of one-on-one meetings, and also in-depth review of those existing taxonomies or taxonomies that were being developed. And throughout the entire process until our approval, we had lots of feedback from our partners and our partnering banks. And after we had our taxonomy draft developed, we were really unsure of who to have it approved by. And at the time, the Vice Governor of the Central Bank of Mongolia advised us to have it approved by the Financial Stability Commission of Mongolia. and we were kind of confused for a bit. And during that time, the Central Bank of Mongolia created a reporting template according to the Green Taxonomy and sent it out to banks and received their feedbacks, and reflecting those practical statistics and feedbacks into the Green Taxonomy, we finalized it and it was ready to be approved. And so on December 10th, we approved our National Sustainable Finance Taxonomy by the Financial Stability Commission of Mongolia. So it consists of all the head financial regulators of Mongolia. So it consists of Minister of Finance, Head of Financial Regulatory Commission, and CEO of Deposit Income Corporation. And this is in line with the fact that Mongolian all layers of okay. Our key partners in this development process was the Central Bank of Mongolia, the Minister of Environment and Tourism, and they played a key role in bringing in ministries and other state organizations. And on the other hand, we had Tsinghua University and IFC, of course, to help develop and really primarily draft the Green Taxonomy and have it revised over and over by other international financial institutions as well. So on our technical partner side, I've listed all the organizations that have given us active comments, and a lot of the consultation process included commercial banks, industrial non-government organizations, businesses, universities, international development organizations and project units and IFIs, as well as technical sector experts. And it is very important to note that the Green Taxonomy was enriched very much because of our international and local supporters. For instance, FMO even had the Bangladesh Green Loan Taxonomy that was in Bengali translated into English for us to use. And just to give you an overview, this is what the Green Taxonomy looks like, and this is an official document which shows that it was approved by the Financial Stability Commission of Mongolia. So moving on to the specifics, I'll hand over to Nomi.
Okay, thank you, Aika. Building on Aika's presentation, I'm going to speak a little bit more about the structure, content, and the objectives of the taxonomy itself, and also share some of the lessons learned and recommendations for SBM member countries that are currently interested or undergoing the process of developing a national green taxonomy. So the overall objective of the national taxonomy is basically to provide a nationally agreed classification framework of activities that basically contribute to Mongolia's climate change and green growth targets. And more specifically, we wanted to provide a common understanding and language around identifying and financing green projects, enhancing investors' confidence and mitigating risks of greenwashing, and also boosting green financial flows from various sources, including private, public, and international investments. And very importantly, also provide a framework so we can track private sector investments into green projects and really understand how much and in which sectors the private sector is making contributions in line with Mongolia's sustainability commitments. It's for the adoption of the taxonomy, obviously the primary users identified as financial institutions. As Aika said, the Mongolian financial sector is 90% dominated by banks, so banks are the primary users. But learning from the China experience, we also wanted to make sure that the taxonomy is adopted by the rest of the financial sector as well, including capital markets like bond issuers, investment funds, non-banking financial institutions, and insurance companies. And in addition to that, we also believe that industries or project developers can benefit by using the taxonomy. And so in terms of the users, we're saying so also industries and project developers can use this as a guide to develop their projects and to seek more green funding. And then as well as verification companies, standard setters, and any type of policy institutions that are working on green labeling standards and centers of policy should really refer to the taxonomy as a basis of policy documents. So the first thing that we did when we drafted the taxonomy was to define define a set of overarching principles that would really govern the development and the implementation of the taxonomy itself. So the first principle for us, very clear, the taxonomy had to contribute to national policies and targets, including our commitments made under the Paris Agreement. The second principle was that address the key sustainability issues that Mongolia is facing, and these can be very different from country to country. As Ayuka said, we are facing a huge air pollution issue here in the country, but in addition to that, since Mongolia is still a developing country, we have some primary needs to improve the livelihoods of our people, including the more vulnerable and lower income population, to make sure they have access to basic things such as affordable housing, clean water, and proper sanitation services. And third, we also wanted to make sure that the taxonomy covers the most high-emitting and key economic sectors of Mongolia. So we have defined energy, agriculture, waste, construction, and manufacturing. You might notice here that we have excluded the mining sector here, despite its strategic importance to the economy of the country. And we also wanted to make sure that international standards, as Sean already also talked a lot about this, it's very important for investments. We are a country that seeks to access also a lot of green financing outside, from institutions such as the Green Climate Fund, other green financing facilities, and development financial institutions. And all the activities under the taxonomy also have to comply with some safeguard standards, and on this one, we have all the requirements described in the Mongolian Sustainable Finance Principles and Sector Documents that were already in 2015. And last but not least, the taxonomy has to go through a continuous review and development process. It's an evolving document, and we agreed that we will look back at the document every 3 years to make sure it's in line with policy shifts, technology developments, and arising needs from industries. So this slide here shows overall kind of a stock taking of the existing international practices that we have considered when we developed the Mongolia taxonomy. And you can see we categorize them into 4 types of general approaches. So there are some broad conceptual definitions. There are more regulatory and legislative approaches, such as the EU taxonomy. There are more market-led standards, such as the CBI taxonomy, and also definitions and frameworks by financial institutions, such as the IFC climate taxonomy. And from our own observation, we thought that many of them talking about the existing international practices. So as we said, many of the frameworks have a lot of commonalities, but also inconsistencies in certain areas. And we believe that countries should have the opportunity on the window to also add activities that are specific to their unique circumstances and strategies. So here you can see the overall 8 categories that we have in the Mongolia taxonomy. So we have clean energy, obviously, and then we also have low pollution energy that talks about fuel switching and some coal alternatives. We have energy efficiency, green building that also have a specific category on green affordable housing. Then we have pollution prevention and control, sustainable water and waste use, sustainable agriculture, forestry and ecotourism, and then clean transportation. And on this slide, you can also see a very small screenshot of the taxonomy table, like document itself. Basically, it provides 3 levels of categorization. So the first one is really the main taxonomy category. The second one are the sectors and the subsectors. And the third level provides more typical examples and technologies to demonstrate what is eligible under each category. And here in this slide, this is to just show an idea of what type of activities and eligible assets we have included in the taxonomy that are very unique to Mongolia. So, for example, we have a category that talks about clean heating appliances and eco-sanitation toilets to address the air and soil pollution issue. And then also we have categories for sustainable pasture management and sustainable cashmere production, since we also have a lot of issues related to land degradation and desertification. In terms of the challenges that we have faced throughout the process, Ayuka already talked about some of them, and we have grouped them here into 3 main areas. I'm not going to go into detail on all of them, but just highlighting some of them. from the technical side, the main problem that we faced was the limited availability of locally accepted and approved industry standards. So, for example, we don't have a green building code yet, we don't have any green certification national schemes, and these are very important to form the more technical, detailed eligibility criteria for each of the assets. So that was one part that was missing and that we still need to work on. As I think it's everywhere, for us also defining adaptation was really difficult. So the taxonomy doesn't really make a distinction between mitigation and adaptation activities. We think adaptation need to be defined by a more process-based approach. And from the strategic point of view, of course, it's the process itself. Coming to agreement on the priorities and the boundaries of the taxonomy is the most difficult part, because we have involved a wide range of stakeholders in it, and really balancing between Mongolia's development needs and sustainability targets was the most challenging thing for us. Moving towards implementation, as Oika said, we have started with the pilot phase of the taxonomy already last December. So we will be receiving the aggregate feedback and results of the reports from the banks according to the taxonomy by this March. And depending on the feedback of that, we'll probably make some adjustments and maybe issue some supplementary implementation guidelines. And the very important next step for us is to develop more industry-specific guidelines, tools such as DHA impact assessment tools, and trainings for financial institutions to really support the implementation of the taxonomy. And we are also looking at developing a local verification capacity for green projects, which is at the moment non-existent here. And then we are also looking at implementing more pilot projects to really demonstrate how the taxonomy can be applied in financing activities. And we have already started with work in many of these areas, but we are also currently seeking more technical partners and development partners that will support us in this process. In the last slide here, we have recommended a kind of a step-by-step approach or framework for the consideration of SBN members based on our Mongolia's experience. And this just highlights some of the key activities that we have taken in each of the phases, starting with the preparation, going to development and the launch, and then in the implementation of the taxonomy. So if there's any SBN member country that would like to learn more about the specifics of each of the steps, we are very happy to speak and share our experience. And this sums up our presentation for today, and we are happy to take any questions. Thank you very much for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you both. And sorry that you were interrupted by technical interference, but I think you captured a lot of very good information, and we heard you very loud and clear at the end. So that's really good. So I do have a first question already to your presentation, which is, so Laura Canavari, she mentions she was interested in the contrast between what Sean said about the EU and science-based targets versus what the Mongolia approach is aligning with national development targets. So how did you find that in the discussions locally, where you just, and how important was it to emphasize the national development targets?
It was, our main challenge came from the ministry side. So we have identified, apart from the National Green Development Policy, many strategies towards energy construction until 2025. They would be including lots of coal, because Mongolian energy is based on coal. And we had to constantly remind them that it was not the issue. What we're trying to do here, what we're trying to identify and define here is not... it is supposed to support the development, but it's supposed to support the development of green and sustainable, and that is going to be the way moving forward. And some of the partners that we have consulted with are still kind of reluctant and stubborn to accept some of the ideas that were exposed, but overall, I think the consultations have done its job, which is to say that it has to align somewhat, but maybe 30% with the development goals and maybe 70% with the sustainability goals. Does that answer your question?
Just maybe to add on that, I really think like the development of the taxonomy itself, the main challenge is to find that balance between everything, between science targets, between development targets, between social targets and environmental targets. So the main job for whoever is taking really lead in this process is to find a way, find that very like the line that meets those different interests and needs. So that was definitely a difficult process, but very clearly we understand that we have to follow science, and we had a lot of technical and science-based experts also involved in the consultations.
Focused on green.
Great. And then just to understand, how do you see this evolving? So obviously there were some categories that you might not have included this time. Do you see this evolving? So for instance, there was one question around sustainable cities, sustainable communities. Do you see this evolving over time?
Yes, definitely. This is an evolving process. Even when we drafted the first framework, for the EU taxonomy, only the first report of the technical group, Sustainable Finance Technical Group, was available. So we couldn't really reflect all the details that were included in the second version, the 400-page document. So definitely we have included in the document that the taxonomy will be reviewed every 3 years based on developments both internationally and locally. So this will be evolving. And there are many categories that people wanted to include, but we thought were not really clear yet because mainly of the lack of industry standards and the technical criteria and the capacity for us to really review and assess those, evaluate this project. So with this reason, we have also excluded some of the categories that were considered at the beginning.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I'm actually going to hand over to our first discussant, Dr. Bolu Wang. She is the Green Project Team Lead at the Research Center for Green Finance Development at Tsinghua University. Before joining Tsinghua University, she was an experienced and solution-focused sustainable investment advisor. So she brings a lot of private sector knowledge, and Tsinghua University in particular has really championed the knowledge sharing that is happening around China sharing its experiences with other countries in developing green bond taxonomies. And I think one of the things we wanted to hear from Dr. Wang today is, now that China has had taxonomies in place for a number of years, what is needed in terms of implementation? I think we've heard things like you need to have verification ecosystems in place. You need to anticipate that this will be used by different parts of the financial sector, and for those industries where you do have definitions, you also need the industry standards in those industries to be commensurate with green finance requirements. So Dr. Wang, please, we'd love to hear from you. Just a few minutes describing what are the most important lessons that have been learned from the China experience that you can share.
Okay. Thank you, Liz. Can I be heard clearly?
Very clearly, thank you.
Okay, that's great. I think Sean and Naomi have touched some points you brought up just now, but I will just speak from China's point of view. And China is the first developing country that developed a nationwide green bond taxonomy, defining which financial assets could be labeled green. A nationwide green taxonomy is a classification system which a green financial system can build on. In addition to the insights on green taxonomy development and international harmonization by the speakers, I'd like to share another lesson that can be learned from China's experience. It is that the quick adoption and use of the green taxonomy by the financial industry it's pivotal for keeping the momentum of green finance. And here is some data to help the audience understand the point. In 2012, the previous China Banking Regulatory Commission issued the Green Credit Guidelines. In 2014, the same regulator issued the key performance indicators of green credit implementation. Until the end of 2018, the green credit balance of banks reached over 8 trillion RMB, which is approximately 1.2 trillion US dollars. In December 2015, the People's Bank of China published the Green Bond Taxonomy to introduce green bond to the interbank market. The next year, in 2016, 48 green bonds were issued by Chinese companies, including 21 financial bonds, 19 corporate bonds, 7 mid-term notes, and 1 private placement note, raising up to 201 billion RMB. The annual green bond issuance reached 250 billion RMB in 2017 and increased to 280 billion RMB in 2018. The quick response to the green credit KPIs and green bond taxonomy by the financial industry supported and encouraged further development of the green financial system in China. So what are the reasons behind the swift actions in China's financial market? I can share some views. The green taxonomy is one of the 4 pillars for establishing and operating green financial system. The other 3 are regulatory incentives, financial instruments, and environmental disclosure. So regulatory incentives means financial regulators make good use of monetary and financial policy tools to formulate regulatory incentives in order to mobilize financial institutions and the real economy. For example, interest rate subsidies encourage banks to extend green loans and issuers to issue green bonds. Green macroprudential assessment and the MLF to include green bonds as collaterals encourage banks to maintain and increase their green credit balance, and etc. Second, the financial instruments. So China's approach is to green its whole financial system instead of setting up just one green investment corporation. I need to clarify here that setting up a special green finance facility is a possible approach for some developing countries. It's just China chose another approach. Because China has a relatively well-developed capital market infrastructure and a variety of financial instruments are available in the market, it is easy to apply the green taxonomy by adding additional green elements to these instruments, such as loans, bonds, asset-backed securities, equity investment, and so on. And innovation of green financial instruments will go on, continue for the coming years. And third, environmental disclosure. In order for banks and other institutional investors to evaluate and monitor the performance of their green assets, the financial regulators mandate the green bond issuers to disclose their use of proceeds and report the environmental impacts of their investments. Since 2020, all publicly listed companies need to disclose their environmental compliance information. Meanwhile, the environmental regulator publishes their corporate environmental permitting and penalty data as an input into banks' IT system. Due to limited time, I need to stop here. You can see that the green taxonomy development works with other 3 pillars to hold up the whole green financial system. I hope China's approach might be of help to other countries and regions. And if you have questions, feel free to reach out to our Green Finance Center at Tsinghua. So this is it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wang. That is, it's a very exciting view on where this is moving. And we actually had a similar case study in South Africa recently. We had a BNP Paribas was part of the issuance of a loan, a sustainability-linked loan of 120 million pounds to a listed company, automotive company in South Africa, Motus. And the interest rate was tied to them meeting their sustainability goals. And what they said was that it was the integrated report of the company, which in South Africa is the requirements are quite extensive for companies to have integrated reports that give you environmental, social, and governance information. And based on the information that they were able to see in those reports, where they could initiate a discussion with Motus about this kind of instrument. So I think we're also seeing that on the IFC side is now there's a lot of innovation and different types of instruments being introduced. So thank you very much. And given that we are coming up for the end of the webinar quite soon, I'm going to invite my colleague Francisco Avendano to also address some of the issues that have come up in the presentation and to give the perspective of IFC's role in helping to move forward alignment and good practice. So Francisco is the global focal point of green finance at IFC, and he leads the design and implementation of metrics and policies for green bonds, green loans, climate finance and guarantees, green trade finance, etc. So within IFC, this work is moving quite quickly in terms of how do we harmonize reporting and metrics and definitions. So he has experience in private equity, mezzanine, multilateral financing, and policies for banking, institutional investors, and other industries. So Francisco, I'm going to invite you to talk a little bit about where you see the trend of alignment and the critical issues that you've mentioned to me before, which is around how adaptation looks different in terms of the openness with which you have to approach the potential projects that could qualify. We've also had a question come in from the audience saying, this is from Liam Gallagher, and given that we are talking about emerging markets, can we expect a consolidated approach to green bond taxonomy across the BRICS countries, especially in the field of sustainable banking and finance? And I think that was also intended for the Mongolia and China speakers, but I'm going to ask you to give the perspective of the alignment and the opportunities that you see going forward. Thank you, Francisco.
Thank you, Luis. Very good presentations. Thank you to the presenters. I think that your question is very timely. We, as IFC, are looking at emerging markets and how they evolve in terms of their practices for green finance. Specifically, we are looking at several developments, not necessarily going in the same direction. For example, if we look at what is the outcome of the EU taxonomy, we will see there, just to give you an example, green buildings, no? And you will see that for the EU taxonomy, green buildings should be near zero emitting buildings. But if we look at the details on how those buildings are going to be achieving the near zero status, you will see that they rely on some policy instruments that are available on the European Union. For example, the capability of a real estate owner to purchase electricity directly from the source, no, and the purchase electricity or clean electricity credits from certain sources. And that mechanism is not necessarily available in emerging markets. It's not necessarily available everywhere. So at the end of the day, the building will need to have some electricity and other source of energy consumption. But it is some of the market mechanisms and policy instruments that will enable the building to be really near zero emitting. So that's an example that provides some of the nuances and differences that we may see in terms of applying taxonomies among different countries. When we speak with our clients as IFC, there is a request. Please make the taxonomy actionable. Actionable for the different market participants. Actionable by different type of issuers, because we may have not just private issuers, businesses, but we may also have public sector issuers. For example, we are seeing already sovereign bonds. And if you look at the intended use of proceeds, not necessarily the intended use of proceeds are going to be included in the available taxonomies. Many times the intent is to use proceeds, let's say, for sovereign green bonds, for public investments, or implementation of public policies. For example, let's say that there is a policy to improve the construction code in a given country, or to restructure some market instruments for the electricity supply and demand. That may have some implications on the emissions profile of the country, and it is at the policy level where the investment or the use of proceeds may happen in that case. And if you look at the available taxonomies, not necessarily are going to be those taxonomies are going to be capturing that. And that's on the mitigation side, you know, which is sort of simple enough to be addressed by a positive list as a first step. But when we talk about adaptation. Adaptation, as you know, doesn't come from a positive list. Adaptation comes from the application of principles, like first identifying the climate risk, then how vulnerable is your activity to that particular climate risk, and then how the investment intends to address that risk and vulnerability. So, and it depends on the location and it depends on the nature of the activity. So we see that there are some challenges to implement a taxonomy based on positive list for adaptation. So there has to be some internal dialogue at the country level, perhaps, and the industry level as well, to make sure that those nuances and specific context are captured. In the case of the different taxonomies that we're seeing in emerging markets, including BRICS, we see that not necessarily they are going in the same direction. In light of this, IFC is developing a green finance review protocol to make sure that the different dots in taxonomies from different countries are at least able to be compared. Let's say, for example, Amundi, an asset manager that is managing the largest green bond fund, and they invest in emerging markets, but many times they will have a bond from let's say an issuer in Colombia, a bond from an issuer in Morocco, a bond from an issuer in China. How do they compare? Can the impact be added? Can the actual project selection be compared? Can we have actionable information coming from external reviews? So that's a challenge, especially for some market makers and market players such as the Luxembourg Stock Exchange that holds an important fraction of the green bond volume globally. And they have an obligation to make that information available to market participants. But if the information that they collect from the issuers and external reviewers is scattered all over the place, then the fulfillment of the duty to organize the information and to make it accessible to others is going to be challenging. So that is something that that we need to keep in mind. Adaptation, the development of adaptation taxonomies will have to happen in this context, in which not necessarily we will have clear elements that can be applied across all geographies. So be prepared for having taxonomies that are sort of harmonized on the mitigation side, but on the adaptation side, it will be more most likely based on principles and a few indicative examples of actions that can be counted as adaptation. And this will have to be guided by principles that will have a common interpretation, perhaps across different geographies. And that's where the harmonization will come. So on the mitigation side, the harmonization may come at some commonality in the positive list. At the adaptation side will come under some common principles and some common interpretation of those principles in each location. So that's where we see things going, and there is a process that we just started with several groups of market participants. We look forward to work deeply with CBI as well on this. Thank you. This is my short intervention.
Fantastic. Thank you, Francisco. And then just quickly, where can people find out more information about the review protocol, and when should they look out for updates?
The timeline for this is to make the protocol available by the second semester of this calendar year. In the process, we are reaching to select groups of participants, including external reviewers. We will have a one-to-one with CBI, as given its prominent role on the market. Also with some stock exchanges and investors that have already expressed their intent to support this protocol to link the dots among different taxonomies. No?
Fantastic, thank you. I see Sean has put on his camera. Sean, do you want to put in a last comment before we head into the final stretch?
If I can, yes. First, a couple of points that are going to be discussed in the future, and then a wrap up. I'm not so negative as Francisco on the adaptation and the resilience metrics, and do have a look at what we're publishing in the European Taxonomy report, which will come out on the 9th of March, where the EIB and climate bonds have worked together very closely to come up with a framework which I think is usable. I think there are positive things we can do in adaptation and resilience. And look at the EBRD green bond that was issued against our climate resilience principles last year as a bit of an example of that. But nevertheless, it is certainly a more process-oriented approach, as Francisco says, than, say, in the mitigation sector. The reason I'm saying this is that I think for emerging markets, the adaptation and resilience agenda is the critical agenda, especially going into the SDGs with a resilience focus. And we'll need to do a lot more work in coming years in taxonomies in all our jurisdictions to provide the adequate rigor and comfort for issuers and investors and governments for that matter. And going back to governments, and this picks up our colleagues in Ulaanbaatar, there is necessarily a tension between science and national priorities. And we need to be cognizant of it. And it's difficult when you're doing the Mongolian taxonomy. I fully understand the story and why. But you know, let's take the NDRC Green Industries Catalogue in China, where rail is excluded. Now, why is rail excluded from that? It would seem, because I don't know for sure, but it would seem because China's actually arguably over-invested in rail, particularly high-speed rail, over the last few years, and it's a national policy imperative to cut that back a little bit to ensure that not too much capex goes and things are not being fully utilised. That's not an environmental agenda because it's very clear that we need to get everyone off fossil fuel cars into electric transport. So from an environmental perspective, as you'll see in the European taxonomy, it's a high priority. So, you know, there are national agendas, but we need to keep an eye on what the science is saying, which may be different to other issues related to national priorities. It doesn't mean that the overinvestment in rail in China isn't a real issue. I'm just going to suggest that addressing it in a taxonomy around environmental investments isn't the place we should be having a discussion. And that should apply to fossil fuel energy development in different countries too. When the IPCC and the IEA are clearly saying if we don't get 50% reduction in fossil fuels in 50 years, frankly, the future for the poor of the world is extremely doubtful. They're saying we will head into catastrophic consequences. We kind of got to wrestle with that, and that will require tension with national development, existing, that is, national development. I raised the EU example because when we started on this, the IPCC and the IEA reports were absolutely not consistent with European Union policy. European policy has now caught up as of last December. Every country is going to have to wrestle with this. Doesn't mean we're going to be able to win these discussions or arguments, and we do have to fit in with national regulatory policy and work of the government, but we need to make sure that our arguments around taxonomy are resolutely science-focused initially and push hard on that agenda, because that's the story of climate change. For the last 30 years, we have not been listening to the science. We have been avoiding the hard decisions, and now we're in a terrible global pickle where unless we reduce emissions 50% in 10 years, I'm afraid there's not much of a future available for the poor in emerging markets. It's going to be very, very grim. 100 million people in Bangladesh are going to have to figure out how to get over that razor wire into India. There's going to be a lot of consequences like that. So I just bear that in mind when we deal with that particular issue. On the positive side, it is clear that this discourse about what is green, about what are sustainable investments, including SDGs, is the absolutely essential task of the next couple of years. And it started, which is fantastic good news. It started in China, it started in Mongolia, it started in Europe. There's more work to be done. But the fact that we're now having these discussions is such a substantial advance from 3 years ago when we were talking about complicated models and national development plans that were not up to scratch. So I'm very optimistic about our potential to move forward. I am concerned, and I think Francisco is exactly right, that we maintain a common principles approach as much as possible. Capital is global, and also we need to make sure it's capital from Japan and Europe and the US that is currently not earning enough yield that is able to be used, at least in portion, to finance where the real work's got to be done, which is the emerging markets around the world. And that will require a common alignment of rules to make this work. That's the framework for the discussion going forward. But, you know, it's such an exciting area to be in. So thank you for hosting this webinar today. And thank you, everyone, for joining in this discussion and being willing and interested to be part of this movement to creating what is a sustainable future, one we all need.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sean. I think you've done a great job to wrap it up, and we're at the end of our time. So I'm going to say, for those who like follow-up information, please have a look at our LinkedIn page for SBN. So look for the Sustainable Banking Network on LinkedIn. We'll be posting updates from this, and Tigist will be sending the survey link and sending follow-up information with a link to the webinar within a week. So I'll hand over to Tigist at this point. Thank you so much to the presenters. You've done a superb job in packaging huge amounts of information in a short period of time. We really appreciate it. Thank you. Tigist, over to you.